please come up to the podium. I believe we have a listing. Come on up. Yes, that's a very good point. Thank you, Lori. So we are having a public hearing on the comprehensive plan amendments. So if you'd like to speak on that, I'd encourage you to maybe wait a few minutes until that agenda item comes up. The mobile home part, right?
I'll wait, thanks.
So this one is more for general and other comments. So does anybody wish to speak generally about anything pertaining to our business? Okay, we'll move on to the next items, which is approval of minutes from the August 21st and October 16th Planning Commission meetings. Any comments from my colleagues or on either one of those? Discussion. I actually had one minor change, excuse me, on that, and it's from the, hang on a second here. I have to pull up my file. Yeah, this pertains to the August 21st meetings. On the third item, it says agenda items. There's a sentence there that reads, Chair Nugent motioned to submit a letter to the editor that corrects what the city misstated as a whole group, and I think it should be what the newspaper misstated. Everybody see that item? Are you good with that as an amendment?
Yes?
Yes. Okay. With that amendment, let's have a vote on, first on the August 21st meeting minutes. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion carries. We will also look to approve now the October 16th meeting minutes. Do we have a motion on that?
Move to approve?
Any discussion on those? None. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion passes unanimously. Okay, now we will open the public hearing on the 2018 Comprehensive Plan amendments, and I'd like to introduce and bring up to the podium our city planner, Lori.
Good evening. So tonight's public hearing is on the 2018 Comprehensive Plan amendments that you reviewed at your last meeting, and we incorporated the suggestions and changes that you requested at that time. The amendments address two topics, the mobile home parks and critical area protections. So the first set of amendments related to the mobile home parks provide more description about the parks, encourage preservation of the parks, and amend the comprehensive plan land use map to add this new designation, Manufactured Housing Communities, or MHC, over the two parks on Northeast 175th Street, Englewood East and Lakewood Villa. That designation is not placed over the four remaining parks, Lakewood, Lake Terrace, the unnamed park on Northeast 181st Street, and Kenmore Village, as the long-term vision for these communities is not mobile home park. The City Council has indicated that protective zoning should apply to these four parks for a period of 10 years, at which point an upzoning with affordability requirements would be applied. The amendments are to the land use element, downtown sub-element, and housing element of the comprehensive plan, along with the map. And I was going to ask Eliana to translate that into Spanish. You can try that one. Go ahead.
El Plan General para añadir una nueva designación de comunidades de viviendas fabricadas, MHC, por sus siglas en inglés, en dos de los parques, en la calle 175 Noreste, Inglewood East y Lakewood Villa. La designación MHC no se está colocando en los otros 4 parques restantes, Lakewood, Lake Terrace, el parque sin nombre, que queda en la 181, y Kenmore Village, ya que la visión a largo plazo de estas comunidades no es como parques de casas rodantes. El Consejo Municipal ha indicado que debe haber zonificación con protecciones en estos 4 parques, pero solo por un periodo de 10 años. Después de esos 10 años, se zonificará para desarrollar más intensamente la propiedad con requisitos de asequibilidad. Las modificaciones son con respecto al elemento de uso de suelos y también el subcapítulo del centro, downtown, y el capítulo de viviendas del Plan General, junto con los cambios al mapa de uso de suelos o terrenos. La Comisión de Planificación oirá testimonio sobre las modificaciones durante esta audiencia pública aquí, hoy en la noche. Yo estaré disponible para los que quieran hablar y necesiten intérprete.
Thank you. So the other set of amendments before you this evening for the comprehensive plan have to do with the natural environment. Again, we looked at those at your last meeting. The recommended amendments update background information and make some minor revisions to associated policies. We anticipate that a more significant set of amendments will accompany the shoreline regulations, so the shoreline sub-element may be more extensive, and we expect you'll see those in the next few weeks. So with that, I'm finished with my presentation, if you want to open the hearing.
Okay, our first speaker is Jim Perkins. So if you could state again your name and address for the record and remarks to 3 minutes.
Thank you. My name's Jim Perkins. I'm the owner of the 2 mobile home parks down the street on 181st. I've been here quite a bit since last December, maybe, when you went through many, many meetings, very patiently, listening to a lot of people very, very involved in this, and rightly so. But there were some big differences, and my recollection was you took those into consideration, and you identified that some were more in line with what you're looking for in preserving affordable housing than some that are closer to the downtown community that maybe aren't in the long-range plan for Kenmore. And I was very comfortable with that. And then I went to city council meetings where I heard some very different opinions of what they're trying to save and accomplish. And I just wanted to mention a couple of things. You're all very, very familiar with highest and best use, and that hasn't been happening down here. These mobile home parks are not at their highest and best use. The one on this side of the street has 11 units. Almost everybody in there is single. There's one Hispanic family. Everybody else is single, or maybe there's a couple of couples who they haven't told me somebody's living in there with them. At any rate, it's been very frustrating because now the beauty salon has moved out and relocated up into Kenmore Village. It's not financially viable, and it is not going to survive what I heard, which is a 10-year what's the term? 10-year, yeah. It's definitely not going to survive that. There's just no way. And of course, in city council meetings and here, I heard people complain about the rent. Harry, when's the last time your rent was raised? Been quite a while. Been 4 years? At least a year. 4 years. Okay. And do you recall what you paid for that home?
My recollection is correct, 510.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you've been there 20 years now? 25. So if you amortize that, he's really gotten a lot out of that home, paying 500 some months a rent. When I had a meeting with Lori and a couple of other people, nobody would ever accuse me of gouging anybody, ever. When we built the parks, we have wider roads, which created less density. That's why I'm envious of the park back here on 182nd and others, where the density is, but we have wider streets and less density, less pads. And like I say, it's not going to work for me. I'm going to have to bail. I'll take a big hit. I've been here a long time. If you look in the Kenmore history deal, I was on the committee that formed the city 20 years ago, and it just breaks my heart. You guys had a good plan, I thought, and I just couldn't believe what the city council came up with and how it's going to affect me. So I've talked longer than I should have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Harry Perfader.
Hi, I'm Harry Perfader, and for the record, I've been living in Mr. Perkins Park for some time. First of all, I want to thank the city of Kenmore. Today is election day, and we're in a position where we live in a democratic society. And it's a wonderful thing for a citizen to be heard. Thank you. Thank you. I represent the other side of the coin for Mr. Perkins, and the people around me do as well. Most of us are in low-income situations. Several people on disability have no place to go. My credit history is terrible. I've submitted a document that in part explains why. I won't be able to qualify, no matter where I go, for a home, for a place to live, because of that credit history. And it's something beyond my advice. I feel it's beyond my doing. I've been a victim of circumstances. My health is good. There are people in these parks who do not have good health. MS, constant bouts to the hospital for my one neighbor who doesn't have MS. So there's differing values here. And one is that people have lived here for a long time. Yes, we've gotten tremendous use out of what we invested. But all that, whatever investment is residual, will be gone because of the cost to, I can't move my place. It's pre-1976. And many of the people in that 11-unit section are in fact, I think there's only 2 that are not. So every one of them is going to lose their entire equity in their home, more or less. I have 45 seconds left. In that time, I just want to say again, thanks. Thank you for hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have no other people listed on the sign-in sheet. However, I see several other people in the audience. Does anybody care to come up and share their thoughts? That'd be great. Yeah, please state your name and address for the record too, please.
My name is Kylan Parks, 4515 176 Southwest, number 43, Linwood, Washington, 98037. And I have stood among you in many times over the last almost 12 months. And again, I ditto Harry's comments. Thank you very much for your patience. I know there's been a lot of disagreements and misunderstandings and all kinds of things and difference of opinions. But I do reflect the fact we do stand here on Election Day with so much division in this country, and let's really open our hearts to everyone. And it isn't one side versus the other. It is about trying to find compromise. And I do believe that this process has been effective. You sent your comments to City Council, and they certainly made their own opinions and judgments. And they still have an opportunity to change. But a comprehensive plan amendment certainly gives a temporary, particularly the temporary zone that the other 4 parks are seeking for the 10 years, would provide them an opportunity to get themselves together. Because again, and Mr. Perkins talks about economical viability of operating the park, and maybe I'm incorrect, but I know in other zoning situations, that is one area where a park owner can come and ask for a rezone in a situation like that. So he would have that opportunity to show that he was economically not viable and he wasn't making the money that he needed to in his business, and he needed to sell the land, and then it would be up to you to decide that, and to the City Council. So I think there is a lot of room for compromise in this situation, and let it be to City Council. And you are all volunteers, and you have spent many long hours. I know, very tired nights and work days the next day. And so I agree with Harry, and I thank you very much for your service. And please take into account all rights. I mean, the landowners, when they say they're not economically viable and they talk about infrastructure, again, I want to reiterate that that is a business decision they made. This was a business. They made a lot of money over the years that they provided this affordable housing, so it was a profitable business. They chose not to take reserves from that rent and put it into the infrastructure, and that's why the community is not viable, because they did not choose to put the money into the infrastructure to make it viable today. So that was a business choice, and I don't know why the homeowners with equity have to suffer for a bad business decision. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody else want to share any thoughts on the comprehensive plan amendments? Okay, seeing none, I will close the public hearing. Our next agenda item is the final recommendations on comprehensive plan amendments. So turn it over to
Right,
to Lori.
so as I mentioned earlier, we had incorporated the changes you requested last time. If you have other changes, we should talk about them at this point. If you're satisfied with the elements, or if you want to respond to any of the public comments, we're hoping that we can get a final recommendation from the Planning Commission that we can deliver to the City Council on the 19th of November.
Any colleagues care to share anything about either the
I got a
public hearing
question.
or?
Is this, the council voted on this, so, I mean, already, what our recommendation on the mobile
Right.
park?
So this process is a little bit unusual in that we did not bring forward to the City Council or to the Planning Commission comprehensive plan amendments or zoning code regulations. We instead took the tack of, it's a difficult topic, and wanted the Planning Commission and City Council to discuss options and to give us some direction before we went to make amendments to either the comprehensive plan or the zoning code. So you all gave recommendations on options. The City Council on the 17th made their recommendations on options, and now we are actually changing the city's policy language in the comprehensive plan, which will serve as the foundation for the zoning changes that will happen in early 2019 in front of the council. So comprehensive plan amendments have to be reviewed by the Planning Commission, which is why it is coming back to you to look at these amendments. Once your recommendation goes forward, then the city council presumably would adopt the comprehensive plan amendments, and then they will be handling the rest of the zoning code amendments.
Does that mean we can recommend a shorter time frame than 10 years?
That's not actually in the comprehensive plan amendments. The comprehensive plan amendments talk generally about preservation. If you wanted to put in something about a shorter, some may be preserved for a shorter time period or something like that, you could do that. I think, though, that you've kind of heard the direction from the city council that they're interested in, and it may prove that you want to wait and let them make the zoning code amendments, which will actually specify the time period.
Well, the last speaker said that they can get a rezone. Is that possible?
So the
Short of
process,
the 10 years?
the process, again, will be part of the zoning code amendments, and we haven't prepared those yet. But there will be some consideration of, as with the Bothell overlay approach, and in other jurisdictions it's handled differently, but there is always an opportunity if someone can't make viable economic use of their property to find some form of relief, whether that's through the transfer of development rights or looking for an amendment of some sort. Again, those amendments haven't been written yet. That's part of the zoning.
Okay, so we're just, I mean, we could recommend a shorter time period? Is that possible?
You can recommend a shorter time period. I don't think that you want to amend the comprehensive plan to say what the shorter time period should be. If you want to, along with your comprehensive plan recommendation, make a corollary recommendation as a group that you think 10 years is too long, you're welcome to do that. We can transmit that to the council.
Yeah, I'd like to make a motion to shorten it to 5 years, a reasonable amount of time. But 10 years seems like a long time for, to hold the landowners to have this property and they can't do anything with it.
Well, we have a motion on the floor. Is there a second? I do not see a second, therefore the motion fails. Are there any other thoughts from our colleagues on the comprehensive plan amendments?
I have a question about the geologic hazardous areas and the staff's recommendation. Could you explain a little bit more about how the recommendation would, how the current process would be different from the reasonable use exception? How do those differ?
Yeah, I think you're talking about the actual zoning code amendments, and we're still talking about the natural environment element of the comprehensive plan. So the comprehensive plan doesn't address that topic. It just provides, and it was, I think, attachment 1 maybe to your packet. It just provides more general information about those critical areas and some policy language. But when we turn to the second part of your agenda tonight, then we definitely will be talking about geologic hazard areas.
Got it. Thank you.
So I have first a process question. The folks here and others who want to speak on the mobile home preservation issue, they will have further opportunities before the council. Is
So,
that correct?
Yes, it will not be a public hearing, but on November 19th, under citizen comment, and potentially under, on the 26th, under citizen comment. I'm not sure about the 26th yet. They would be speaking to the comprehensive plan amendments. Then in January, the city council will take up the zoning code changes, and there would actually be a formal public hearing at that point for everyone to speak.
And will there be the same sort of public outreach as there was in our process? So the folks in the mobile home parks, the owners, everyone who was involved in our process will know that there are still, that the city council's, as I understand it, recommendation is not yet final.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah,
I just want
absolutely.
to be clear about that for the folks who are here and others.
Yeah, yeah. And so all of the property owners are on the mailing list. Many of the folks who've participated in the project are on the mailing list and continue to get information.
Okay. Thank you. Any other comments on these amendments?
Just a question, on the question of the 10-year versus some shorter period of time, would it be appropriate to have that brought up at the city council hearings?
Absolutely, yeah, and that will be most, it could be brought up at the time of the comprehensive plan. It's more a zoning issue, at which time that would be formalizing that period of time through the zoning. And so that would be a good time to bring it up, and particularly through the public hearing.
Are you talking about as individuals or as a commission, or what's your?
I'm thinking as community members or others who wishing to have an appropriate discussion of the zoning when that is
Right.
actually the time and place when that would be discussed. That
Correct.
would be the appropriate place to have that. Whereas we could make an informal, planning commission could make an informal statement, but it would have no real weight other than that this really needs to be something that needs to be addressed in front of the council as part of its process.
Could you give us an estimate of when those zoning public hearings might be?
No.
Okay.
We will be taking back preliminary amendments, I hope, to the city council in January. That's the goal. And whether they want to refine that, I assume that they would before they scheduled a public hearing. They, as you may know, extended the moratorium on the mobile home parks, and I think April 8th, I want to say April 8th is the end of that extension, so we certainly hope to have something in place before then.
Okay. So there's still opportunity for the public to comment on those zoning overlays.
Right.
And if we wanted to individually present something to the commissioners at a public comment section, our first opportunity would be November 19th and the 26th, is that what you said?
November 19th, it's scheduled. The
Okay.
November 26th, I don't know how it's going to appear on the agenda.
Okay,
So, but I certainly could, I mean, if you look at the agenda on the 26th, you'll see
okay,
how it appears.
thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, are you looking then for a motion from us, Lori?
Yes, on your final recommendations on the comprehensive plan amendments, both the ones related to the mobile home parks and the one related to the natural environment element.
Well, do I hear a motion on that point?
Motion to approve. Second?
Second? We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion passes unanimously.
Great. And there's just one more piece related to this. I don't think a joint meeting is planned for this topic, but if you wanted to, I don't know if you want to send a representative or whether you want just the staff to present your recommendations on the natural environment element and the other changes.
Any thoughts on that from the commission on that?
Well, I would agree. I think we haven't that much material difference from our earlier discussions, and I think we could rely on the staff to explain that.
I would agree with that, so with those shakings
that-
of heads, Affirmatively.
Okay.
It's on you, Lori.
All right. Thank you, I think.
We've weighed in on mobile home parks.
Right. But just to clarify, these are comprehensive amendments that basically are bringing them current to comply with state and federal guidelines, correct? And the discussions we've had the last couple of meetings are really what we were working on, and the document that we have tonight reflects that.
Well, the comprehensive plan is adopted by the city in relation to state law, correct?
Okay.
And so these amendments make it possible for the city council
Right.
to pursue different zoning approaches.
Okay.
Okay, the next item is critical areas and shoreline master program amendments.
Oh, yeah. So, here we are again. Amy is here, as is Bill Laprade. And Bill is our geologic expert. And so we asked him to come along because, as you can see from the staff memo on this topic, we had some policy questions before we prepared amendments to the geologic hazardous areas section of the critical area rules. We had 4 questions that we thought would be helpful once we have the answer to guide us in redrafting those amendments. So the 4 questions, we're going to start with those, and they are, as I mentioned, in the staff memo on, I think, the second page. I too will find my way to them. And they have to do with the treatment of geologically hazardous areas, particularly landslide hazard areas. So the city has a number of landslide hazard areas. Some are more significant than others, and historically the city has regulated them all the same way. So that whether it's a high landslide hazard area or a moderate landslide hazard area, the presumption has always been that if you come in for a development and you can provide a report from an expert that shows that the project will be safe and will not create problems for your neighbors and that kind of thing, that you can proceed with your development. The gap analysis, I think, that you looked at had a new standard that would allow the city to request a third-party review if there was some concern about the geotech report. But that is actually something the city has asked for in the past when there was a concern about safety. The problem that we face is that even with geotechnical reports, there have been situations where there have been slides or damage to infrastructure or problems created despite the geotech report. And in fact, we have been sort of talking internally about the fact that in all cases, we have been able to have an applicant submit a geotech report. So there's not a case where a geotechnical engineer has been unable to say that a development could proceed. Given that, and given new, better mapping information that we've been getting through LIDAR and work that the state has been doing, we are thinking about whether or not to differentiate between areas that are at high risk of landslides versus areas that are at moderate risk of landslides. And so the first question that we had is, does it make sense to differentiate between high and moderate landslide hazard areas And the corollary question that goes with that is, should new development actually be prohibited in high landslide hazard areas? And then the follow-on questions ask about some options that would make it, make that more palatable, presumably, to property owners. So I don't know if Mike wants to ask his question.
Certainly, I think, yeah, I have several questions too, but if Commissioner Vanderline wants to
Well, I'll kick
kick it off.
Actually, I have an earlier question ahead of the question about reasonable use. How would you, what's the differentiation, or how would the city go about differentiating between high and moderate level of risk or hazard?
The button should be up. There you go.
Oh, there we go, okay. Well, let me start by saying that the DNR, the state DNR, since OSO was funded and given the responsibility to come up with new maps. And they finished Pierce County. They're about 80% finished with King County, and they're working on Whatcom County now. And as part of their protocol, they took their protocol from the state of Oregon, which has completed all their studies, and now they're applying it with revisions to the state of Washington. The protocol sets up conditions for essentially high, medium, and low. And the lows are just everything that is not medium or high. The highs are the highs and it has they're also divided up into deep landslides and shallow landslides. And in the world of geologists, the difference between deep and shallow is either about 10 feet or the depth of the rooting level of trees, which is in the 6 to 10 foot range. So the highs are essentially, there's a high for shallow and a high for deep slides, and also a high and a moderate for shallow landslides. For deep landslides, the highs are those areas of known or definitely identified big landslide masses. Those being the big landslides that are just on the hillside to the other side of the river, and down and the big ravine that's down just south of Arrowhead Drive. And then there's another one up in the very north end of the city. All in all, I believe there are 6 or 8 of these areas. And then enveloped around that is a zone of essentially a buffer that they've applied around that. And then the highs for shallow are the slopes exceeding roughly, it's not exactly 40%, because you already have the 40% on your books. It's, they go through some equations to come up with, engineering equations to come up with it, and it's almost, it's just about, it's like 38 degrees or something like that. And then they have buffers, again, they have buffers on that. And then the moderates are, the moderate and the deep, on the deep slides is actually, a buffer on the buffer. That is calculated from the original buffer, and it gets kind of complicated, okay? What's even more complicated is the moderate for shallow landslides, which takes into account 4 different factors, including geologic unit, geologic contact, the direction of landslides, and the angle of the slope. And it gets pretty, that part particularly gets pretty complicated. So that's the, sorry for the long-winded explanation, but that's what it is. So the state is mostly finished, and they've done a preliminary map of the city. I've seen it, and there were some real issues with it. So I pushed back, and I understand also that King County is pushing back too. There's some things on there they don't like, and my understanding is that Pierce County is also pushed back and has decided to take the data and do something different with it. So by pushing back and saying this won't work for the city of Kenmore, and also from King County and other people's comments, the state is now thinking that it might take them a couple more months to rethink some of the criteria and some of the protocol that they're using, because they realize that if a bunch of jurisdictions aren't going to accept it as it is, it hasn't really served its purpose. So anyway, that's where we are right now.
Thank you. So my takeaway is that the protocols are not quite soup yet, that we still is a lot of questions out here about just how the science needs to be applied and how we would actually apply this on a map. That was a question, but the follow-up to that is, am I correct in understanding that the objective, the intent at some point would be that the state would come out with mapping that would show where the high, medium, and low is, and the city would adopt that? The underlying question is, this would be something that would be determined outside of the city, it would be determined by a statewide agency?
To some degree. So we already have the high landslide area maps, and I think you've seen those. Those were attached to the comprehensive plan information. So that information we have. What we don't have yet is the moderate landslide, and it's only going to be high and moderate. And the moderate, we will wait for the state and then look to see what those maps look like. But in some ways, it's almost irrelevant, because the high landslide hazard areas, we know where those are, and the moderate are defined in the current code. And so in terms of the policy direction, we'll have the written definition of a moderate landslide hazard area. We'll have the maps, however they come out, and our critical area maps never are the defining factor. As you recall, there's always a caveat on the map that says whatever happens in the field is really what is the defining factor. So if you don't show up on a wetland map and then you go out there and there's a wetland, you have to respond to that. Likewise, if you were out in the field and you saw a property was steeply sloped and it didn't show up on the map, you would have to respond to that. That's just the way our maps work. We don't do property-specific maps. But where I'm going with this is, despite not having the map, I think the policy notion of whether you want to differentiate between these high and moderate landslide hazard areas is still a question that could be answered at this point. And then it'll be, as we get the maps, if we have to refine things, we could.
And to your question, I thought I heard in there that last little bit about having to take what the state gives you. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think you would have the opportunity to take what the state gives you, but you could do some revisions to it for Kenmore, the way you want to do them. And it's similar to what I told you about Pierce County. They're taking the data and they're reworking it to what their governing body wants to do. So there would be that opportunity to tweak it according to what you want to do.
And I guess in my mind, actually, my concern was actually the other way around, was opposed to that, which is how much discretion or subjectivity gets built into this, and how much can be introduced at the local level. If the science is created and applied at the statewide level, but then the city, someone within the city can redefine this, where's the control on that? And I appreciate the fact that there always has to be some give, subjectivity to it, But if you're going to designate a high and low, and then you're going to have zoning and other requirements related to it, it's good to have, at least in my mind, it's good to have some idea of what is the science behind high and medium, and who applies that and when, and what's the process for that. So I would say up front, I'm supportive of the high designation and doing something different with that. But support, in my mind, would have to be contingent on having some understanding of how those designations are applied, what are the exceptions to it, what's the process for exception to it, before it has some comfort that it actually be effective in any way.
Yeah, and one example of that is the size of the pixel that you, on the map, that you want to control or regulate. For instance, right now, well, the map that I originally saw was down, they were controlling things down to 45 square feet. No, that's hardly anything. But yet Bellevue does 1,000 feet. And in my conversation with DNR, I said, well, what's the magic number? And they said, well, actually, we don't know. So one of the things they're going to do here in the next couple of months is decide what size of an area are they going to regulate down to? Because right now, it's just, somebody just, 1,000 feet, somebody obviously picked that out of the air. And so they're going to try to get a better handle on scientifically what's the size that might be reasonable to control.
Again, it sounds like there's a lot of unknown here, and maybe in a month or two, we'll have more information on this. But so, a policy question we can answer, but a confidence in being able to finally approve that, we need to know, at least I need to know more. I don't know how the rest of the commissioners feel.
I've got a question. This high designation, is that a prohibition of any development?
So the way the code currently reads is that in any geologic hazard area, high, moderate, there's no distinction currently. So any area, you have to provide a report that meets certain criteria that shows that the project you've proposed is going to be safe and not cause a problem. What we're looking at, because of the fact that we've had a history of projects that received reports that said that, but then that didn't really happen, is that in these high landslide hazard areas, we're saying no development. No geologic report that says it's okay, unless you're in a case where your whole property would be undevelopable, which is a reasonable use exception. But then in the moderate, it would still be the same standard as it is currently. Provide a geotech report, and then you should be able to proceed.
And you said that everybody's pushing back. What are you pushing back on? What are the...
I think it's the mapping.
The map criteria themselves.
Right.
Yeah, because they're only, and maybe I should throw it out there, I've done some research in the past, and then also I just last week I looked up for this meeting, I looked up some of the regulations again. There are really only two jurisdictions in Western Washington, that being King County and Whatcom County, that have a prohibition on development or subdividing land in landslide hazard areas. And in those, they also have the reasonable use doctrine. All of the others have, you can do something with it with a geotechnical report. So you wouldn't be the Lone Ranger, but there are other people out there doing the prohibition. And King County's had that for years, and they continue to keep that up.
Yeah, I share Mike's concerns a little bit. I think conceptually distinguishing between high and moderate sounds reasonable on its face, but what you're talking about in terms of the granularity of where you draw that line seems to be a pretty critical uncertainty. I mean, it could affect different parcels. I would like to know more about, again, how that would be applied. So I just want to kind of share that myself. Had a couple other questions, sort of background questions. The areas that are in question, it looks like if there is to be any development there, it would predominantly be residential. Is that correct on the map?
I think most of the high landslide hazard areas are residential.
Right, okay. Is there any, I mean, it looks like one of them might, I'm kind of looking at this big map here, might touch the north edge of 522. I don't know if you can pull the map up. There's a
Yeah.
sort of a long slug-like shape. I'm just trying to get a sense of what this might affect in terms of potential development.
Are you talking
If I'm looking at the, what is that, sort of an
over on the
aqua color?
61st?
Yeah,
Over on 61st, steep
Yeah.
slopes along 61st?
yeah.
So,
Right. In fact, that's an area actually where the city has seen landslides. I think there have been some road damages. Yeah. You're talking about over on the west side
Well,
of
yeah,
the
I'm just
city,
looking at
north
that
of
map there,
522.
yeah. It looks like,
Mm-hmm.
right. So there have been landslides, done any property or road damage
Yeah.
in those cases?
Mm-hmm.
So that would potentially affect this area, which I guess is abuts, I'm not exactly sure what that abuts. Is there commercial development there right now?
I'm trying
Do
to
you
think if
know?
it goes that far south. I don't know, Mark, how
Okay.
far south that goes. It looks like it comes all the way down to 522, but I'm thinking about that property right there, and the hill slopes up farther to the north, I think. So again, the cities, maybe what would be helpful is to have the city's existing map, and you can compare that with this map, because we already have rules about landslide hazard areas. In fact, our whole zoning reflects that. In many areas, the zoning is R4, which is very low-density residential, because of the steep slopes. So my assumption, and we could verify that by looking at the existing map, is that we're not identifying brand-new areas, but it's just more refined as to where these landslide areas are.
Right. Okay. Anybody else have any questions at this point on that?
Yeah, I got a question. Isn't it the soil very important, like glacial, till
Till?
is pretty stable, right?
glacial till is,
Yeah, and you could have a steep slope and it would be safe, isn't it?
correct. But in general, in western Washington, and also, I believe, in Kenmore, from what I'm remembering about the geologic map, is the uplands are covered with till, but the slopes are not. In many cases, all over Puget Sound, the upland areas were overridden and are covered by till, but then the slopes are not covered either because it was eroded away due to landsliding, or there was still ice there later and more materials were banked up against them. But it's usually the uplands that are covered and not the slopes, which is where you get the landslides, and that's where the clay and the overlying sand are also exposed.
I had one other question, maybe jumping ahead maybe a little bit, on the exception that's been proposed, the all reasonable use, how does that work? What kind of decision-making process is in play? Are there appeals or examples on how that, plays out now, I guess,
Yeah.
or might play out?
Right, so there currently in the critical areas code is a reasonable use exception process. And that's a process that has been used in the city, mostly to do with wetlands, wetland buffers. And it's a process that you apply for it because the typical rules that would apply in your case would make development on your property you just couldn't do it. You would be prohibited from developing if you followed the rules. And so this process is one where you look at things like, well, we definitely want to allow you to do something, but it needs to be the minimum necessary. If you don't need a 20,000 square foot home in your wetland buffer, if you could live in a 2,000 square foot home. So there's a look at size and extent of impact, and then looks at things like mitigation for the impacts that you've created potentially. But it's opening the avenue to make sure that a piece of property can be used. It's not like you would have a vacant property.
And the process is entirely within the city
Correct.
government? There's no?
Yeah,
Okay.
correct.
If the city turns a person down, can that person appeal to some other
Right.
entity or?
Yeah, it is appealable, and right off the top of my head, I can't remember whether it's it's an appeal to the hearing examiner, the city's hearing examiner.
I had one more thing I just wanted to kind of maybe ask about, and I wondered, is there any potential provision for, say there is a high landslide area, is there any provision or possibility of having, some kind of structural fix that someone could do to, either minimize or eliminate the landslide risk as part of, perhaps as part of an exception process? Is that at all feasible? And I don't know, from a structural standpoint what that looks like, but is that something that other jurisdictions may consider, or?
Well, that's the way the current code reads. So the current code, you can't develop in a landslide hazard
You cannot.
area unless and until you have a geotechnical report that says that how you've designed the building or the road or whatever it is going to be safe and is not going to create a problem for others. So again, that's the current code standard, and the question is, have there been cases where that standard has not been adequate to protect either the structure or the neighboring property or whatever it is? The answer to that question is yes. So you can take two approaches. You can continue with your approach that says having the report and having an expert certify that it's going to be safe is the best way to go. Or you can take a different approach, which is to say that in areas that are high landslide hazard areas that we know you can't develop there. You can develop on the part of your property that's not in the high landslide hazard area. Or we would talk about increasing density on the part of the lot that wasn't in the high landslide hazard area. Or you would get a reasonable use exception if you couldn't develop your property. So those are kind of the two different directions you could go with this question. And I guess that's the fundamental policy question about whether you think one or the other way to go is better or more suitable.
I guess,
Any thoughts? Go.
yeah, in partial, maybe self-disclosure, and I've said this before to the commission, I live on one of those very steep slopes. There is no question, it is a high-risk slope. I've had development to the south of me, and I've had development across the street to the north, and we have seen substantial landslides that have cost the city a substantial amount of money to take care of problems with roads and drainage afterwards. I have no faith in the geotech approach. It seems like it's very easy to get a geotech person to come in if you pay them the right amount and talk the right way, and to get what you want done, because I've seen it done. And now we're looking some years later at the obvious fallacy of that approach. So personally, based on personal experience, I like the idea of having a higher bar for high-risk slope areas. My primary concern is being able to understand, being sure that those are properly and appropriately designated. But I think we need a different approach. It's clearly not working. It's costing the city money. It's difficult for the landowners who have to look at that and face that down the years, or even just looking at the uncertainty of what could happen in a few years. based upon what you see all over our neighborhood. There has to be a different way to approach this. So, end of my sermon for the night.
Yeah. Well, I think I've heard a couple of us sort of answer, I think, at least conceptually, the first question about the differentiation between high and other landslide hazard areas. Do other people have thoughts on, I guess, either the concept or have particular methods how it might be applied? So I'd invite others to kind of weigh in on that question. Do you want us to take a vote? Lori, what would be proper to proceed in answering?
Well, I don't think, we're quite ready for a vote, but it would help, as we move ahead, it would help us to know whether we should approach it from these two different angles. We're going to do one thing in areas that we think are high risk, and we're going to do something different in areas where we think are moderate risk, or we're just going to stick with the status quo. That would be very helpful to have some direction from the commission so that we at least give you a first draft that reflects.
Make a stab at an amendment or a motion?
Sure.
My motion, we would direct the staff to continue its investigation of creating a new standard for approach in high-risk slope areas, landslide areas, and come back to us with that recommendation after they've received the additional information on the mapping and how you would differentiate between high and medium slope areas.
Second, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion?
Just a question for staff. The map that we have in our packets indicating with the green, the landslide, that's not differentiating high from medium. This is standard.
No, I think in terms of the mapping, I think what we can do is provide the maps, the current landslide hazard map. We can show you where the high landslide hazard area map is, and then perhaps in the meantime, we'll just assume that moderate hazard is everything that's on our current map that's outside of that until we get the information from the state. The state information is going to be really far along in this process. So to wait for that state map is, that's going to be next spring, and we'll be well down the road. But we could, in the interim, not go to a greater extent than we have currently, but make clear where the high landslide hazard areas. Does that make sense?
Okay, any further discussion on that motion? All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Passes
Great.
unanimously.
All right, so question number 2 is kind of already answered. And then unless I hear, these last 2 questions really were our ideas that might make it okay if we went to this more restrictive standard. One would be to say that if you've already built a structure, that you can remodel it or maintain it or whatever, as long as you have a geotech report that shows you're not going to slide down the slope. So because there are, I think, existing houses in these areas. And then question 4 really was, could we talk about transfer of density? For example, if you had a big property and you could build, or you could subdivide into lots, but some of those lots are in high hazard areas, could in fact your lots in the part that's not constrained be slightly smaller, more reflective? For example, if you were R4, it'd be more like lot sizes for R6 on the property that was outside the landslide hazard area. That's the concept. So if you think those are workable concepts, then we would write those into the regulations as well for you to look at.
I notice here, you mentioned expansion of existing structures. Do you have a, I don't know, a footprint in mind, or?
No, I think I really was thinking of any expansion. I don't, if you have a house that's already in a high landslide hazard area, if you wanted to expand your house and had a geotech report, should there be a limit on that? I'm interested, I'm looking at Bill to see if he has a reaction.
Yeah, I don't think it should be limitless. Yeah, I mean, what if you had a little tiny shack there and you wanted to build a mansion? Yeah, that's a different, it's still the same people. People are the people, but then the actual things on the land could make it actually more of a risk, because you're developing more, you're putting more utilities in, more roads, more cleared land. So that's a good point. So we might want to think about something to limit the expansion. You know, when I first thought about this, I was thinking more of it in terms of somebody putting a deck on their house or building an extra bedroom. But, you know, what if they went super aggressively, and then that would defeat the purpose of this. So that's a good point. So maybe we could come up with something that would be more definitive. You could.
Well, that's pretty definitive.
The thing is, though, the thing is, though, some people are stuck. Yeah, some people are stuck. They built in a landslide area before they knew it was a landslide area, and some may not be as obvious as yours, but some people might end up being quite surprised down the road that they're in a landslide area and they want to do a remodel or put another story on their house, and they couldn't. So, you know, you have to think about those kinds of things. But gross expansion of something, that's something different altogether.
At a piece of property where there was room to subdivide it, there would be even more constraint, because even if you made the density, you accommodated for that by making the lots smaller. Obviously, the structures would be smaller, but you might still get the value out of your land. But if there's people down below you and you do that, or around you, and it compromises their property, you know, that's the risk. How can the city take that risk? To make a process that could potentially endanger existing properties around it.
Well, I would in no case ever suggest that you should subdivide a high-risk landslide hazard area. This was
Okay.
the notion that if you're, say, half your property was landslide hazard area,
Right.
and you would have been able, if you could subdivide that, to put 3 houses on it.
Right.
Maybe on the other half, where there is no constraint, you let 3 extra houses go in on a smaller lot. You see
Okay.
what I'm saying? Rather than say, you've lost these, we certainly wouldn't do it if it was going to be in the landslide hazard area. That wouldn't make any sense.
So it's not just a carte blanche trying to accommodate growth. It's doing it within limits.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
So if there's really
Right.
this high landslide, then perhaps no is the answer, for unless they can provide the geotechnical proof, right?
Well, that's not quite what we're talking about. In high landslide, it would be no development, but in the portion of a property that wasn't high landslide, maybe instead of requiring a 7,200 square foot lot, you would allow a 6,000 square foot lot so that you could squeeze in a couple extra houses that they couldn't build down on the landslide hazard. That's the idea.
Yeah.
What occurs to me is, as we said earlier, many of these areas are already zoned R4. And so the option of being able to cluster, I'd be concerned about, does that mean you would then, if you had the ability to divide a lot and say that, so you could put 6 houses where you were zoned for 2, is that what you're saying? or they would still be limited to the R4 designation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything written, but, so I couldn't give you a specific, except the one thing I have noted, and I have heard actually from a number of folks over the years who were interested in comprehensive plan amendments, is that they are zoned R4 because they're in a landslide hazard area. We don't have high or moderate now, that's just blanket. You're zoned R4 because you're in a moderate or high landslide hazard area. All of your neighbors are zoned R6 because they're not in that area. And so we've had people say, why can't I put lots that are the same size as the person across the street, next door, when I don't have a constraint right here? So that's the kind of a thing that we would be trying to address. And I don't have specifics at the moment. That's just the policy idea.
It may be worth exploring. In practicality, I just don't know. Does that really exist in nature out here?
Right.
The difference between an R4 and an R6, and what that would look like in a residential neighborhood that is already a dense slope. I just don't know if that's really, if we had, a multiple acre property out here that included as part of it a dense slope, but there was a buildable area, if that existed in nature, I'm not aware of anywhere in the city where it is, then maybe that would be worth a consideration. But I think most of the areas you look on the map of these, they're residential areas, they're single-family homes.
Right. So there may not even
It
be
may
an
not be a
ability.
practical. I'm not sure how much effort you want to put into something. You might want to take a look at that, just what
Look at the aerials.
potential is before you put a lot of effort into it.
Number 3, I'm a little unclear on the purpose of the remodeling. Under current code, would there be any prohibitions on remodeling in a landslide area?
Yeah, you would have to get a geotechnical report to do that.
You'd have to address bearing capacity and lateral movement issues. In some cases, if you were just going up, then you'd have to look at the bearing capacity specifically, or if you were expanding outward, the considerations would be looking at stabilizing that part of the slope that you're moving toward, those kinds of issues.
Right. And those both seem to fall into the expansion category of going up or out. Remodeling, I was imagining, is in place within the current footprint.
Oh, yeah, no, I wasn't thinking remodeling within the current footprint. I mean, if you, for example, were putting different cabinets in your kitchen, I mean, I don't think we would require anything for that.
Okay.
So maybe it's the terminology.
Yeah, I was just
Yeah.
getting confused between remodeling and expansion.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Any more thoughts on question, I guess, 3 to start with? So expansion, that seems like that, again, that's something you'll bring back and maybe refine and, so yeah, that might fit. Is that the
Yeah,
plan? Okay.
I think so.
So to answer, do you want a motion again for the sort of general question about should that be, I guess, allowed?
Let's talk about pursuing the concept. If you're comfortable with me and my group here pursuing the concept, we'll try to write something that incorporates that concept and bring it back for you to look at. Does that seem okay?
Head shaking good?
Yeah,
Okay,
it's fine.
I think
Okay.
you got the nod. Nods. And then the fourth question, any further discussion or thoughts on that? Just curious, does that affect accessory dwelling units? So if someone in that area wanted to put in an ADU, away from the hazard area, that would just be like any other,
Right,
I guess, new development on that property then, right?
right,
Okay. So it wouldn't affect it one way or another.
right.
Okay.
Just reiterate my earlier comments about what's the practicality of this.
Yeah.
I think it's maybe worth your time to invest a little in that before you
Yeah.
put a lot more effort into it.
I think
I
that's a
just-
good point.
I have concerns about not only being impractical in terms of the size of lots that you really have in these areas already, but even if there was something, that unless it was a very large lot, multiple acre, where you really were talking about a development, that clustering smaller lots in any of these neighborhoods could have an impact on the character of the neighborhood.
Right.
I'm not sure it'd be appropriate.
Yeah.
So do you want a head nod again?
That's
On
fine.
question number 4? You guys good with, guys and gals good with pursuing that? Okay. All right.
Great.
You have direction.
Thank you.
Okay,
So we'll excuse
okay.
Bill unless you have any last
Anything else?
questions for him.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Okay,
coming.
You're welcome.
So the next piece of the critical area discussion tonight has to do with 2 sections, streams, and we've expanded that to acknowledge that it's streams and lakes, actually, and then fish and wildlife habitats. So all of the information I think you've seen in previous form in the gap analysis. We've discussed all of these changes. I think I might call out just a few of them so you're aware of that, but otherwise I would recommend that you consider the changes by exception, things that you caught that you were concerned about. So the significant issues, we did the change to stream lake classification system that we talked about in the gap analysis. Refined standards for public walkways and trails. We have new standards related to buffer modifications when there's an improved right-of-way or a building or something that interrupts the buffer. New opportunities for alternative mitigation plans. New opportunities for mitigation banking and an in lieu fee program once those might be established. And then we used the revised list of protected habitats that you went through actually in quite a bit of detail through the gap analysis. So those were the things that I called out as being significant from my perspective, and so we're ready to answer any questions or...
Any questions from? I had no questions either, so
Wow.
we've already been through this in
You have,
substance,
actually.
so I don't
These
know.
2 particular sections you spent quite a bit of time with.
Very faithful rendition of everything we said.
So, is there anything more you need from us other than?
No, just probably
asking-
your endorsement. There are a few minor amendments that we've heard from other folks about that I might mention, and then you all will see the full packet before it goes forward to hearing. In one case, in ditches, in the way ditches are differentiated from streams and the way that man-made ponds are differentiated from lakes, there was a question about the presence of fish. And we had one of the staff members say, well, what do you mean? You mean like koi? Or if they have goldfish? And so we are making a recommendation that the word native be put in front of fish in those 2 areas to clarify that we really mean native fish and not introduced domestic or otherwise fish. And then the other change had to do, it was a request from the Muckleshoot tribe to make a change, and we might actually save that because we are meeting with the Muckleshoot tribe representative tomorrow to kind of go over the draft changes, and she may well have other things that we would want to bring back to you. So I think it might be better just to bundle those comments together. All right?
Okay, anything else?
So we'll move ahead with these as presented, a preliminary to hearing, and we'll have some potential other changes after
Okay.
tomorrow.
Can you, just for our benefit, sort of preview the next couple, 3 meetings then on?
Yes.
Process.
So, in fact, we should talk, there's one meeting that we wanted to be sure there was a quorum for. So your next meeting is November 20th. And at that meeting, we were hoping to present the section on frequently flooded areas and a new section on groundwater. It's very short, but you all talked about that at a meeting where there was going to be a susceptibility map. And then the shoreline comprehensive plan changes, and potentially the first set of shoreline regulations. So that's on the 20th. And then on December 6th, we were going to finish up the shoreline regulations. At that point, we'll aim to bring back the geologically hazardous area regulations. That gives us some time to draft these changes. And then we might also have the public agency and utility exception proposal at that point. Then that's December 6th, 4th? Okay, December 4th. And then the next meeting, obviously, is, let's add 7, 18, and 7.
18th.
The what? Thank you. Is the 18th, December 18th. And we would, at that point, sort of do cleanup for the other changes that you've requested or that come to our attention. For example, if FEMA reviews our frequently flooded area rules and has some changes, we may need to bring things back to you. So one question we had was whether that we would have a quorum on December 18th. I know that's kind of right in the middle of holidays. Okay.
I'll be here.
4, I see 4 head nods. Oh, Scott.
You don't have to be here. If we have a quorum.
that was an option.
November 20th is the week of Thanksgiving, correct?
Correct.
So is everybody here on that Tuesday of the week of Thanksgiving? Okay.
Okay,
like
so it
we're
looks
good
like we
for
have
that
a
meeting,
quorum.
okay.
Okay.
No
And-
reason why.
And so after the second meeting in December, what we would be doing would be assembling the whole package of all these little sets of amendments you've looked at. Maybe you may wish to give it one more review all together, but then it would go to hearing.
In January? Yeah.
I think in January, yeah.
Okay.
Right, correct. I think it's possible that there will be a new proposal from the Housing Strategy Plan. Oh, right, the PROS plan, Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan, that's a big comprehensive plan amendment. And maybe something from the Economic Development Strategy. So it hasn't quite all been sorted out, but that's kind of what we think. I'll be there.
Any other business before the commission? Anything else anyone wants to bring up? This meeting is adjourned.